Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome on behalf of the organizations Dignity and Penal Reform International, who have organized this side event. We're conscious that we have a lot of competition. There are lots of interesting side events going on in parallel. And so in order to make the findings of this side event accessible to people who could not join us, either because they're in parallel side events or because they're not in Geneva, we're webcasting this side event, which I wanted to draw your attention to. I want to thank very, very much our co-sponsors. We're quite proud of the honorable list of co-sponsors that have supported this side event. First of all, the mission of Denmark, the mission of Chile, but also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I also want to thank the panel. Also a quite illustrious list of experts, I think, and I hope it will make it worth your while coming to this side event. If we can't nourish your stomach, at least I hope we can nourish your brains. And I would like to hand over to Ambassador Stauer for a welcome and first remarks, and would just like to emphasize how great the support of your mission was. We couldn't have asked for more commitment of a co-sponsor. Thank you.
That's true, but you could have asked for a better room. But it's in a high demand, I know, at this time of the year. I note with great pleasure that today marks the annual day of discussion on women's rights at the Council sessions. I think most of this discussion taking place during the day is a very positive celebration of the forces of change supporting the further advancement of the rights of women. There are also, however, part of this day is also a strong reminder that we are still far behind in a number of areas, and this is exactly one of these areas that we're going to highlight this noon discussion. We're very honored to co-host this side event with specific focus on women in detention, together with the government of Chile, together with OHCHR, Dignity and Penal Reform International. Chile and Denmark are, together with Mexico, with Morocco, with Indonesia and with Ghana, partners in a new initiative launched during the last Council session in March for the ratification and implementation of the Convention Against Torture. It's a 10-year initiative which aims at universal ratification and universal implementation of the Convention Against Torture at the 40th anniversary of that convention in 2024. We launched this initiative in March because we want to strengthen our attention to implementation of international human rights law. And I have to say here very clearly that whenever we discuss implementation of the Convention Against Torture, places of detention are of course crucial. The conditions in prisons and in detention facilities will inevitably be a very key focus for the Convention Against Torture initiative. We hope to be able to utilize this campaign, this initiative, and this opportunity also to focus and to learn more about the realities of women prisoners as a particularly vulnerable group. As established under international law, women's specific needs require different and sometimes greater attention in order for them to enjoy their rights equally to men. However, as a minority in the prison system, which is, we have to say, primarily designed for and run by men and for men, the opposite trend seems to happen. Female prisoners are overlooked at the expense of their dignity, of their well-being, and of their human rights. Globally, there are more than 625,000 women and girls in prison, and the number is constantly rising. The majority are imprisoned for petty and non-violent offences, and across continents they seem to be suffering similar types of discrimination in the prisons. In other words, we are dealing with a systemic issue for which we should be able to find systemic answers. In 2010, the UN rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, that's what we usually call the Bangkok rules, provided such an answer by requiring criminal justice or prison systems to consider the gender-specific needs of women. The Bangkok rules in our view, should serve as a key set of standards that can and should be used by national policymakers and prison administrators, but also as a reference document for UN bodies in order to assess compliance with human rights standards. And one of the purposes of having this side event at this juncture is basically to support and to further an increase in awareness of the Bangkok rules. We still have a long way to go until they have become a household name. We look forward to hear from distinguished experts, researchers and practitioners during this discussion on what steps have been taken at the national and international level to increase the protection of women in detention and to address their particular needs and vulnerabilities. I'm sure that some of the speakers will also highlight the challenges ahead of us, notably the remaining gaps in protection, and hopefully they will also offer us some advice on how to move ahead on this important question. I thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador. In fact, the UN Bangkok rules are one of the key instruments that we would like to promote with this side event, but we would also like to draw your attention to the various areas and issues where women in the criminal justice system, women in detention, are discriminated against, which are issues that are less often mentioned. And so we find it particularly suitable to highlight these issues today on the day on the rights of women. We're trying to flesh out a few of these areas, starting with offenses that specifically or disproportionately target women, but also the links between violence against women and offenses that women commit. And I'm very, very delighted to pass the floor to Ms. Frances Radai, the chair of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice. Just to also say that Frances will have to leave earlier, so apologies for that, but we're very glad that you can join us for the first part.
Well, thank you very much. So I'll begin again. I want to thank the organisers, Penal Reform International and the Danish Institute Against Torture, for inviting me to participate in this event. I will be focusing on those aspects of the work of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice which are relevant to this discussion. And if one looks at the Bangkok rules, the first highlighted rule in the pamphlet is keep women out of prison. And I think that my address is very much concerned with, focused on, keep women out of prison. I'll focus my intervention on 3 issues. The first, the issue of women detained for what I call crimes against patriarchy. In particular, their so-called sexual offences. Second, I will discuss the problem of women imprisoned for responding violently to domestic violence. And third, I'll discuss the nexus between care responsibilities and detention. Through this very brief statement, I will place an emphasis on these women who should not be in prison at all, and whose imprisonment is itself a phenomenon of discrimination and violence against women. Firstly, let's talk about crimes against patriarchy. In some regions of the world, women may be detained, prosecuted, and punished for sexual offences such as adultery, extramarital sexual intercourse, sometimes including women victims of rape, or prostitution. The working group has addressed this issue particularly as regards adultery, and has issued a call to governments to repeal laws which criminalise adultery, noting that the enforcement of such laws leads to discrimination and violence against women in law and practice. The call by the working group is path-breaking. Previously, human rights mechanisms based urgent appeals regarding adultery on the commutation of death sentences for adultery on grounds that there was an unfair trial or that the death penalty is too harsh a penalty for the offence of adultery. However, the working group considers that this is not enough and that the offence of adultery must not be regarded as a criminal offence at all, and women should not only not be stoned for such acts, but also should not be imprisoned for such acts. Adultery laws have usually been drafted and almost always implemented in a manner prejudicial to women. In some countries where the law prohibits adultery for men as well as women, men are permitted to take more than one wife and also to enter into temporary marriages. So there is no symmetry, even if the law actually says on the face of it that adultery for men and women is prohibited. There are countries where the law against adultery is equal, apparently, for men and women. To our surprise, there are states in the United States of America where there is prohibition of adultery as a criminal offence. However, these laws have been in disuse. The last case of the use of any such law was in 1983 and did not result in imprisonment for the party accused. The working group, so that to decriminalise would obviously be logical in view of the fact that the laws are in disuse anyway. The working group emphasised that in its call for the abolition of the decriminalisation of adultery, that the criminalisation of sexual relations between consenting adults is a violation of their right to privacy, infringing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is also a violation of CEDAW's prohibition of discrimination in the family, maintaining adultery as a criminal offence, even when on the face of it applies to both men and women, means in practice that women will continue to face extreme vulnerability and violation of their human rights to dignity, privacy and equality, given continuing discrimination and inequalities faced by women, and given the data which show that the prosecutions brought for adultery have been almost always against women, and when they've been against men, have been against men as the partners, as the sexual partners of the married women, not against husbands for committing adultery against their wives. In other words, where men have been prosecuted, it has been in the context of the married woman's adultery, not in the context of the married man's adultery. The working group has cognizance of good practices where some countries have remedied this violation of human rights, of women's human rights. There was a 1996 decision of the Guatemalan Constitutional Court which struck down the Penal Code's punishment of marital infidelity or adultery on the basis of the Constitution's equality guarantees and on the basis of the CEDAW Convention. Similarly, in 2007, the Ugandan Constitutional Court overturned the adultery law that penalised women for adultery while leaving their male partners unpunished. It should be added that European countries have all decriminalised adultery. So that is the adultery ground for imprisonment of women. And again, decriminalise adultery and keep women out of jail. Second, imprisonment of women defending themselves against domestic violence. As has been highlighted by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in her last report to the General Assembly, there is a strong link between violence against women and women's incarceration, whether prior to, during, or after incarceration. Evidence suggests that incarcerated women have been victims of violence at a much higher rate prior to entering prison than is acknowledged by the legal system generally. While there are women who are incarcerated for committing crimes without extenuating circumstances linked to prior violence, the undeniable link between violence and incarceration and the continuum of violence is a reality for many women globally. The working group, in its report on its official visit to Moldova, in its country visit to Moldova in 2012, noted that 40 to 50% of women in prison have been sentenced, 40 to 50% have been sentenced for killing their husbands or partners due to domestic violence. These cases are often not treated as self-defense, nor are mitigating circumstances considered in the sentencing. In its report on its visit to China, its country visit to China, the working group noted that a large number of female prisoners have been jailed for killing or wounding abusive husbands after enduring years of domestic violence. China has indeed executed a number of these women, including mothers. In one study of 121 women in a Sichuan prison who were convicted of killing or injuring their husbands, 93 were convicted of intentional homicide, 71 were given suspended death sentences or life imprisonment, while 28 were jailed for more than 10 years. The working group has noted the call by the Supreme People's Court of China for leniency in such cases. There is also evidence of courts in the United States which do not regard the killing of a violent husband or spouse or partner as grounds for mitigating punishments for the killing. As the fact of violence is not regarded as a mitigating factor in imposing prison sentences on women who have killed violent partners in some states in the United States of America. So it's cross-regional. This problem is cross-regional. The third area that I want to point out is care responsibilities and detention. In our report this year on economic and social rights, we point out that care functions are the very basis of human life and society, and whether paid or unpaid, they are performed solely or largely by women. This is not a normative, but a descriptive statement of what is going on in different countries in the world, in all countries in the world. So long as these functions continue to be performed by women, imprisonment will have a disparate impact on women. It creates severe problems for women in pregnancy and breastfeeding, which is, of course, a biological function of parenthood, women's biological function, or in tending to toddlers, which is a social function of child-rearing, which women mostly undertake in all societies. Older children are severely affected by the absence of mothers, and the children of imprisoned mothers are far more likely to be placed in orphanages or other institutions than are the children of imprisoned fathers, because of this child-caring function that women take on. Furthermore, mothers may lose their homes and jobs while in detention, which may prevent them from reclaiming custody of their children who've been placed in the care of the state or other persons when they come out of prison. This problem of mothers and children also results in greater emotional stress for the imprisoned mothers themselves, and may be one of the reasons which the UN Bangkok Rules Toolbox points out, the reasons for the fact that in England and Wales, women in prison are 10 times more likely to harm themselves than men in prison, because the emotional stress of women separated from family and from their caregiving roles is deepened and aggravated by this separation. A number of detention facilities around the world make provisions to accommodate young children of detained mothers in an attempt to alleviate the effects of separation, yet challenges remain in providing an appropriate physical and psychological environment for children and in ensuring their well-being and development. And that is true even in the best funded and equipped prisons. Prisons are not a place for children. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has raised issues of babies living in prison with their mother and the inadequacy of such environments for them. In some countries, there is growing awareness of the need to shift from incarceration of women to community sentencing for female offenders, given the fact that the majority of women offenders rarely pose a public threat. It is imperative that states consider and increase the consideration of alternatives to incarceration for women where applicable. I thank you for your attention and look forward, I'm afraid, to hearing only the beginning of the other presentations. I wish I could hear it all, and look forward to further cooperation, future cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. Those were already three really important hints on areas where women are discriminated in the criminal justice system. If I may just add that women in many countries are also detained for their own protection if they're at risk of falling victim to honor crime, etc. So this is another area that we can't go into detail here today, but where clearly there is an issue of discrimination against women in the context of detention and criminal justice systems. But also we have seen that women face challenges in affording legal representation because they may not have access to the family budget, but also because they may not be able to afford bail or fines. This is why they might end up in prison in the first place. So there are various areas that kind of translate from or range from offenses that are specifically penalized for women over disadvantages within the criminal procedure to then the situation in prison. Frances has mentioned the close link between violence against women and women in detention. And I'm very, very glad that Federica Donati was able to come here today, because there is a really very, very important report by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. I want to emphasize this because I think it's the first ever report where really an emphasis has been given to women in detention, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
May I make just one last, because I have to go, may I just make one last comment, and that is, the working group, its upcoming theme is family and culture, but the year after that, the thematic work of the working group will be on safety, health and safety. And we will be looking at women in prisons, in custody at that stage, maybe in both reports to some extent, but particularly at that stage. So we would very much appreciate staying in contact with you and having your input into our work.
Thank you. And you will have all the possible support from us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and let me thank the organizer for having me here. As Andrea mentioned, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Ms. Rashida Manjo, sends her regrets. She was not able to be here with you today. So she asked me to present basically and to give you an overview of her report that she presented to the General Assembly in October of last year. And the title of her report is Pathways to Conditions and Consequences of Incarceration for Women. So let me give you just an overview, and then you can go and read the report at your own leisure. But basically, the Special Rapporteur in this report illustrated that there is a strong link between violence against women and women's incarceration, as Frances mentioned, whether prior, during, or post-incarceration. And the evidence suggests that many countries are witnessing a disproportionate rate of increase of women being incarcerated compared to their male counterpart. It further suggests that incarcerated women have been victims of violence at a much higher rate prior to entering prison than is acknowledged by the legal system generally. Gender and other stereotyping can have a disproportionate negative effects on women, including increased sentencing patterns and specific forms of violence as compared to male prisoners. Women belonging to ethnic and racial minorities also face a disproportionate rate of incarceration, for example. The report also discusses the reasons for women's incarceration, which vary, and I'm not going to go into the details because Frances already spoke about it. Maybe just to add to next to what Frances has said is that the report also mentioned, for example, as reason for women ending up in prison is being incarcerated for crimes such as prostitution when, for example, they become victims of sex trafficking. Also for obtaining abortions when abortion, for example, is illegal in that particular country or legal in very limited circumstances. That could be another reasons why women end up in prison. And also in some countries, women are in prison for leaving their homes without permission, for example, for running away from their homes. And also domestic and international anti-drug policies are a leading cause of rising rates of incarceration of women around the world. And also, finally, the women's political activism that has also given rise to arrests and detentions in many countries. In relation to condition of detentions, the report also discusses the fact that some countries hold women in pre-trial detention for long periods. It then discusses the conditions of detention and the lack of a gender-responsive environment, which is a global problem, because women prisoners often face conditions that are worse than those experienced by their male counterparts. They are vulnerable to numerous manifestations of violence, including rape by inmates and guards, being forced sometimes into prostitution. In some contexts, the women and men are even housed together in the same facility or sometimes even in the same cell, with increasing risk of abuse. Psychological violence, including solitary confinement of women and girls, can be another form of abuse, particularly when applied for an extended period of time or used as punishment. The report also discusses the fact that there has been instances where there was a correlation between solitary confinement and high suicide rates and attempted suicide amongst women prisoners. So many custodial settings do not offer adequate and timely mental or physical health care for women inmates. The failure to consider women's specific needs results in ignoring the productive health needs and also medical conditions stemming from a history of poverty, malnutrition, physical or sexual abuse, drug use, or inadequate medical care. We heard from Frances, so I won't go into it again. The incarceration of women significantly impacts both the children left behind and those forced to live with their mothers in the detention facilities. Their report, which was presented last year at the General Assembly in October last year, was well received by the member states, and some of the discussion, for example, that emerged during the interactive dialogue that the Special Rapporteur had at the General Assembly revolved around the lack of proper health care in prison and its impact on the reproductive health of incarcerated women, challenges, for example, faced by LGBT women and those that become pregnant while incarcerated. The mandate has, apart from this thematic report, which, as you said, is one of the few that examine in depth this issue, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur has also looked at the condition, women in detention throughout her country visit reports, and that even well before the Bangkok rule were adopted, and she does that systematically. She visits prison on detention facilities in all her country visits, and so her findings are evident in a number of country visit reports, like in El Salvador, Kyrgyzstan, in Zambia. In Zambia, she visited the women's wing of Lusaka Central Prison, and she found that those conditions of detention could amount to degrading practices. She has also highlighted some of the good practice that she has encountered during the country visits. For example, in Italy and in the US, she has observed a number of good practices in terms of condition of detention and alternative to detentions, and she has highlighted that during the country visit. And also, just for you to know that besides the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, there are many other mandates of Special Rapporteur, special procedural mechanisms that look into these issues. And primarily, as the Ambassador mentioned, is the Special Rapporteur on Torture that has addressed the situation of women in detention in a quite systematic and thorough way. And for example, last year he presented to the General Assembly a report on the review of the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. And in that report, he called for the role of authority to exercise effective control over places of deprivation of liberty and ensure the personal safety of prisoners from physical, sexual, or emotional abuse to be strengthened, as in accordance with paragraph 9 of the Bangkok Rule. The report clearly demonstrates that the lack of awareness of the realities being faced by women in detention and lack of awareness of the Bangkok rules clearly is an obstacle to the application of gender-specific standards. So in terms of recommendations of the Special Rapporteur report, she clearly recalls the duty of the state to address the structural causes that contribute to women's incarceration and the risk factors related to crime and victimization, and the need to address these in a holistic manner. She also reiterates state obligation to act with due diligence to prevent, respond to, protect, and provide redress for all forms of gender-based violence. In some countries, there are also, she mentioned that there are emerging practices and ongoing discussions on the need to shift from incarceration to community sentences for female offenders, and we also heard from Frances. So it is the Special Rapporteur's hope that the governments continue to engage on best practices in relation to alternatives to incarceration, but also to in relation to integrating the Bangkok rules into national legislation in order to guide the reform efforts to improve the treatment of women prisoners. The Special Rapporteur also would like that, in a form of recommendation, that the Special Rapporteurs, the special procedures in general, can be catalyst and should be used to advocate for a wider application of the Bangkok rules at the national level, given that they have the opportunity to engage with members of the judiciary, of the law enforcement agencies, and make pertinent recommendations during their country visit. And also she calls for resources to be made available for capacity building and training of members of the judiciary and law enforcement officials involved in the criminal justice process in order to develop expertise on gender-based responses. So in conclusion, the Special Rapporteur really looks forward to further cooperation, first of all among the special procedures mandate holders, member states, and civil society in relation to this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Federica. If I may just cut in briefly, you mentioned that there's a rising number of women in prison. Just to maybe emphasize that, in fact, the rates of women in prison are increasing, and they're increasing at a faster rate than men, which is an interesting thing to look into why this is the case. As we've heard from Federica, drug policies, particularly harsh drug policies that penalize to a high extent use and possession, seem to have a higher impact on women because they tend to have low levels within the hierarchical structures of organized crime and are easier to target for law enforcement. But this is just roughly summarizing some of the findings of the few research projects that have taken place. So just to emphasize that I think one of the reasons why women offenders, women in detention, are often overlooked is that they're, of course, the minority in the population in detention, but at the same time their number is increasing, and there seems to be some problems of discrimination also behind that increase at a faster rate than men. Talking about women in prison, it is a logical thing to turn to the subcommittee to prevent torture, to report to us what they find during their country visits, where they're specialized in visits to places of detention, documenting and making recommendations. And we found in the subcommittee, and in particularly in Ms. Mariamo's a very committed, passionate ally in fighting for the rights of women in detention. I would like to thank her for specifically flying in for this event. And you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for organizers, for participants. And before I get to the core issue of my presentation, to tell you in a nutshell about the main findings of the SPT about the women in detention, I will just give you a really brief overview of the activities and the mandate of the SPT, because I'm not completely sure that all people in the world know what is SPT about. So in a nutshell, really, so there is a convention against the torture which was adopted already in 1984, and also it has optional protocol that was adopted 2002. And according to the Article 2 of the Convention, each state party should take all appropriate measures to prevent the torture happening in its territory. And OPCAT, I mean the optional protocol to the Convention against the torture, created 2 monitoring mechanisms to see how countries or state parties are doing in that regard. Firstly, it was the international monitoring mechanism, the subcommittee against the torture, which is SPT, where I come from, and the second tier is the national preventive mechanisms. That means the smaller monitoring units that should be created by each of the state parties that should really closely monitor all the closed institutions in the given country and see how different groups are doing in are their human rights protected. So SPT cooperates very closely with state parties and with the MPMs, and we also have a lot of feedback regarding detainees, different vulnerable groups in different detention facilities, and therefore we have a pretty good picture, I have to say, or overview what is going on in our state parties. Not necessarily in all of them, which is 72 at the moment, but in most of them. And besides this cooperation and information collection, of course, we also go and visit ourselves. We do different types of visiting, but it's mostly the full state visits that allow us to really get into the place of detention and to see what is going on there. And from there, I also will bring you some examples what we have discovered. And of course, I mean, as all the UN bodies, we are also bound by the principle of the confidentiality, so I will not give you the names of the states where we discovered something, but it's the general overview rather. What I will tell you about is, well, the gender-specific issues, of course. I will not stop on questions like overcrowding or the area of cells or something, because these are common for men and women in most of the countries. So I only bring out the examples where women are discriminated or treated differently against men. Well, it is not necessarily that in all the penitentiary institutions where we go and where women are also residing, they suffer from worse conditions than men. Sometimes actually the conditions can be better. It depends greatly on the prison management as well. But for example, women are treated in more humane way by guards or prison officials, or they get more nutritious food. But it's not necessarily that women actually enjoy all the time such a preferential treatment, because actually as a result of such a treatment, they might be victims of reprisals by male prisoners or by some of the guards or something. So you can see that in some places we have really found that women want to be treated exactly the same way as male prisoners in order to minimize the risk of ill treatment just because of the more preferential treatment. Well, already, like we heard before, there is clear issue of the lack of separation between male and female prisoners. For example, we have noted the presence of men in women's cells, and when there is no clear separation, so the tendency could be that women find it tempting, so to speak, to work as a prostitutes for male prisoners in order to get money or some other items they need. But again, I have to stress you that in some instances, women reject the idea of being separated from the men. And that is because men get much more liberties in prison. They can move freely around, they can visit, for example, market or do some things, have more communications with outside world. And if women are completely isolated from men, then they feel that they are isolated of all these possibilities as well. So as the messengers or as the couriers between the market or a shop and the women detainees, they find men quite useful. The second issue is lack of female personnel in prisons. And it's very widespread tendency, of course, all over the world that there is not enough of female members of the personnel, for example, female guards. Well, purely the working conditions are very tough in prisons, and in many countries also women are not deemed to be working, so where to get the guards to prisons if women are normally not working? Lack of women staff means that in many occasions there is no member of women's staff on the spot when it's needed, when women in under the detention have to be contacted. And also application of disciplinary measures then for women detainees is carried out by men. And of course, second and even more frequent problem is absence of female medical personnel in place of detention that host also female detainees. In some establishments there is absolutely no availability of female medical staff, and in other ones, for example, once per month or something, comes a nurse or some member of female medical staff. Women have to be therefore examined either by male medical specialists if circumstances allow, regarding culture, religion, and so on, or they have to just wait until the same-sex specialists come to visit in a prison. And naturally, it's more acute even regarding the pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, and those with small children. And even if it's possible to visit female healthcare specialists, the access to such services should be asked still, and getting the approval from the male guards or the male members of the staff. There are, of course, many other unjustified differences between female and male prisoners. In many occasions, just women prisoners have fewer possibilities for recreation and fewer rights for whichever activities than men. For example, male prisoners could work in the prison, but no similar possibilities created for women, or the access is simply denied. Also, access to other activities like education or sports is denied, or provision is remarkably poorer for women. Female prisoners can take part only of activities that support social stereotypes. For example, they are provided only like sewing courses or cooking, but not, for example, classes of higher education. Women are denied of the right for conjugal visits, but men are granted such rights. Men could have a walk in a corridor, provided that no women detainee was present, but women detainees could not. Also, access to communal facilities such as prison market or walking yards is curtailed. Cells for women are smaller or in worse condition, and women are created less often as the parole, as there is not enough supply of training and rehabilitation programs for women prisoners. Of course, very often it occurs that the detention conditions for female prisoners are inappropriate, and most occurring problem here is the lack of personal hygiene items supply. This concerns both the items that women need themselves, or the items that they need for their small babies in prisons. Such basic items are either not provided at all, or they are provided against some payment. And in some instances, it's purely dependent of the works of the NGOs who are working project-based and who sometimes can bring some such needed items into the place of detention. In several detention institutions, extremely harsh and unhygienic conditions have been observed, and particularly for those women with young babies or for pregnant women. In one establishment, women had to get fresh water from the men's quarter without men detainees being isolated. Also, the food provided to pregnant or breastfeeding women is not sufficient or nutritionally adequate for the maintenance of their health in such specific circumstances. And, well, of course, no gynecologist services available. In one occasion that I saw personally myself, all women detainees were obliged to work. There was no possibility to unsubscribe from this, and if they wanted to, they got the disciplinary punishment. But the thing was that this work that they had to do was extremely harsh. No occupational safety measures were provided, and even for male detainees or whoever men labor force, it would have been really, really physically demanding work. And in addition, it should be noted that number of states have not developed a policy aimed at ensuring that action is taken to address the special needs of women in prison. And that is a very unfortunate tendency, of course. Well, like I started, I have to remind you that actually there is a dual monitoring with a framework of this visiting the place of detention, that is international and national. And what I've seen is that, unfortunately, the knowledge of specificities of female detainees is quite low, both internationally and nationally, and therefore I have to tell that SPT is really grateful for the Penal Reform International, who has taken the advocacy for the PANGOC rules and then the great training tool as the priority on their agenda. And then the SPT itself, during our next session, we will benefit from the training carried out by the Penal Reform International to also raise our awareness of the issue. And we try to also promote this possibility to the MPMs, our counterparts in the national forums. And I, of course, strongly advise all of you to do the same in your national level, to promote the PANGOC rules and the issues of women under the detention, because only in such ways we can improve the situation at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Mari. That was a quick overview of some very, very concerning issues. If I may just pick up one thing that I think is generally not so known. I mentioned earlier that women are the minority in the prison population. That, of course, means that there are fewer women prisons, which results in women often being housed together with men, as Mari has mentioned, all the problems that come with it. But it also means that women are particularly isolated, because these few women prisons are usually then further away in terms of the distance from their families, and so they have far less visits than male prisoners. And another reason for the fewer visits usually is that women are even more stigmatized than male prisoners. And it always stunned me to hear that male prisoners get a lot of visits from their spouses and wives, whereas women seem to be rejected as soon as they get in conflict with the law. So there is a problem of isolation, which of course then also continues once women are released, not being able to be taken into the family again, etc. You mentioned women do not want preferential treatment. I just wanted to briefly pick up on that. That of course the Bangkok rules incorporate the position that to provide for specific needs and characteristics of women prisoners is not discrimination. To treat unequal persons equally does not ensure equality. And just to make one very obvious example, we've heard about hygiene and healthcare needs, which obviously are not the same for men and women prisoners. And I like the quote of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in this regard particularly, which said the replication of healthcare services for women are not adequate. And one other striking example for me always was that in the standard minimum rules, in the rule about hygiene, you have an explicit rule on shaving items to be provided, but it took 60 years until we had the Bangkok rules, to also mention sanitary pads for women prisoners. So just to give a few examples, illustrations on the fact that preferential treatment doesn't mean women have it so much nicer in prisons. And it also recalls a comment that the US corrections officer made. She said, people have the perception that women prisoners get everything and men get nothing. In fact, women get everything that can be provided for free. And that's it. Talking about international standards and hearing from UN human rights bodies about their observations and reports, that bears the question, how much has the UN system in fact absorbed the Bangkok rules and other standards that relate to women prisoners? And I'm very glad that we have expertise on that as well on our panel with Theresa Ritter from the organization Dignity, our dear co-organizers of this side event.
Thank you
Theresa,
very much,
please.
Andrea. Well, okay. So, thank you very much, Andrea. As co-sponsors of this event, I would also like to, or co-organizers, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, and particularly the UN mission, the Danish UN mission here in Geneva, and the Danish ambassador, who both of them have been really making exceptional efforts to make this event come true. And I would say without your efforts, this would not have happened. I would also like to thank the UN mission of Chile and also the OHCHR. And finally, Penal Reform International, with whom we are organizing this event and building cooperation in the field. Now, as Andrea mentioned, I have the pleasure of giving you an overview, or rather I would say just a flavor of the attention that the UN treaty bodies have paid to women in detention. And I should say that our co-worker here, our lead researcher, Joanne Baker, and has been working on this study over the last year and a half. There are copies down at the end, which you're all welcome to take. The presentation that I'll make today is actually very much based on this study. And of course, we're very thrilled to be able to present the results of this study on this particular day. The research here basically combines two lines of research. The first part is an empirical study of the needs and the vulnerabilities of women in detention in 5 countries around the world. So here you will see an ethnographic study which portrays the voices of women from prisons and from detention centers. Apart from the voices of women, we also try to pull out good practices, because although there is still a long way to go in the way in which women are being protected, we have also spotted some good examples. The second part of the study is a desk study, and this is a study of over 250 reports and concluding observations of the UN treaty bodies over the last 6 years. And we focused on 4 main treaty bodies, which are the relevant ones in this field. And these are the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Torture, CEDAW, and finally the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. So this is just to give you a little bit of the background, and I would definitely make some advertisement for this. You can also find it on our webpage, but there are free copies down there. Now, from our empirical research, what I'm going to do this afternoon is to try to highlight 3 main areas which are particularly important to women in detention. And these are safety and security, first of all. Secondly, healthcare. And finally, contact to the outside world, which several of you have already talked about. And for each of these 3 themes, I'll try to outline what attention the UN bodies have given to them. So if we move to the first theme, safety and security in detention, this obviously is a field which is important to all prisoners, but it's especially important to women because, as has been mentioned before, women may be at greater risk of sexual and other abuse and also of discrimination due to their gender. So the issues that the UN has given most attention, according to our research, and which has also shown the best level of gender analysis, is the need to separate female prisoners from male prisoners and staff. This is an issue which lies at the core of the standard minimum rules, and it's an issue which seems to be high on the radar of the UN system. Gender-based violence. This is another issue which has a strong display of gender awareness, by the UN, but I would say that regrettably, gender-based violence inside detention only receives a fraction of the attention that the UN has given to this issue in the outside world. Now, CEDAW has been pioneering this work in the outside world, but it seems still that violence behind the bars is something which is not always being picked up. Another area where we see serious challenges in terms of safety and security, these are body searches. Body searches, this is an area which is known to be a high-risk area of abuse. And here both CAT and CEDAW have long held that states should ensure respect for the dignity of persons who are being searched. And I would say it's also notable and commendable that since 2009, CAT has even been expanding on states' obligations, stating that they should establish strict guidelines on strip searches, stating that they should seek alternatives to searches, and finally that when they carry these out, that should be under strict supervision. So here again we see that the bar in terms of protection is being raised. A final area in terms of safety and security is solitary confinement. This is what usually is called, I think, the Scandinavian practice. I don't know if it was invented in Scandinavia, but we use it quite a lot, unfortunately. And this is where prisoners are being isolated 23 hours a day without any contact with other inmates. This, again, quite positively, is on the radar of all the UN treaty bodies. And their recommendations to states range from amending national legislation to reviewing and restricting the use of solitary confinement. But I would say on the negative side, not a single UN report addresses the use of solitary confinement on pregnant women, on women with infants, or on breastfeeding mothers, although this is very specifically called for by the Bangkok rules. So again, here we see there is a gap in the knowledge on the Bangkok rules. Now, moving from safety and security, I'd move into the second main topic that we found to be very important to women, and that's healthcare, access to healthcare and health generally. Now, not surprisingly, prisoners generally suffer from very poor health, and generally conditions of health are worse in the detention and prisons than in the population at large. I think this comes as no surprise. But when it comes to female prisoners, this tendency is even more pronounced. And quite recent research, which has been published in The Lancet, and our own research, which confirms these results, have shown that women actually have a higher prevalence than men of most diseases. And this includes mental health diseases, it includes HIV, and also cancer. So women in prison are more ill than men, physically and mentally. Now, if we turn to the UN treaty bodies, it's clear and quite positive, of course, that the right to health is a concern that is raised regularly. And states are recommended to take a wide range of measures at policy level, at practical levels, and also financial measures. But I would say that while the UN's focus on health is quite broad, if we talk about the scope, then our review has revealed that there's a low regard for women's particular health needs and for gender as a concerning fact for women in prison. So here still, there is a gap in the protection. Those UN reports that do apply a gender-sensitive perspective, they mainly focus on basic barriers to healthcare, and they're mostly related to pregnancy and childbirth. But meanwhile, other important areas which we can find mentioned in the Bangkok rules, these go below the radar. For instance, I can mention mental health care. This is something which is a huge problem for women, but nevertheless, it's only been addressed 6 times by the Committee Against Torture in the period which we reviewed. And also CEDAW has only picked up this issue once. So here you can obviously see that there's a large gap in the awareness by the UN bodies. Unfortunately, the same is pretty much the case when we turn to HIV prevention and treatment. Here also, this is an area which is given relatively modest attention. I should say, in all fairness, that reports from CAT, from the Human Rights Committee, and also from the SPT have called upon states to protect detainees from contracting HIV, and also to provide tests and treatment for HIV. but not a single one of these committees have approached the problem of HIV with gender sensitivity or attention to women specifically. So here again, an area which one could call for in terms of improvement. A final concern in the area of health is substance abuse. Now, substance abuse is something that we see across the board, both in male prisons and in female prisons, but quite surprisingly, women have a higher rate of substance abuse than men. And despite that fact, only one committee, namely the Human Rights Committee, has picked up on this issue, and they've only done so in one report, and even, I would say, without reference to women specifically. So also in the field of health, I would say, both quantitatively and qualitatively, there is still some way to go. The final theme that I want to touch upon is contact with the outside world. This has been touched upon quite a lot already, but I think it also shows how important this is for women. And in our research, it came out, actually, I would say, as the top priority, that women and their thriving and well-being in prison is very much dependent on the contact that they have with their dear ones outside the prison. It's important to the morale, it's important to the rehabilitation of inmates, but we've seen that for women, this has especially a very important meaning. Particularly when we look at mothers, there's a great emotional and psychological need for them to stay closely involved with their children. Francis spoke of this just a few moments ago. So this is an area where we can see that the relations or the lack of relations really tremendously impact on the well-being and on the health of women in detention. Now, if we turn to the UN treaty bodies, unfortunately, I would say that this is one of the poor areas where the realities on the ground do not resonate with the practice and the attention paid by the UN. We've seen that there are findings and recommendations on the issue, but they're usually gender neutral. They do not take into account the particular needs of women and their particular vulnerabilities and roles as mothers and as caretakers. So they do not really reflect what the detrimental consequences are when the contact between mother and child is jeopardized. Andrea mentioned this also a moment ago, that, for instance, the right to be imprisoned reasonably close to home has been given limited attention. And this is an important issue because, as you can imagine, with only few women prisoners in a country, they will be placed in one or two prisons. Now, if we're talking about Mexico or the Russian Federation, these are huge areas, and family members may have to travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to visit their relatives. And quite often, due to stigmatization and due to lack of money, then these women simply do not get the visits that they are entitled to. So this is just a very brief overview of 3 topics. We've treated a lot more in this, so I definitely invite you to read this book. On a final note, I would like to rank the UN treaty bodies. This is definitely not comme il faut in the UN, where we don't like to rank countries, but I'm going to take this occasion to rank the UN bodies. So there are a few ones here today only, so we'll see what the reaction is. I would say that if we look at all 4 bodies, the SPT is the one that leads in treatment of women in detention. That is quite clear. It focuses on women as a distinct group in several of its reports, and sometimes it even, as the only body, it refers to individual provisions of the Bangkok rules. And I think this actually reflects a deeper knowledge and also an application of this specialized UN protection. However, there's always a negative side to things. I think the SPT findings, what we have analyzed is that they're very much descriptive. They're not sufficiently analytical. We feel that there is still a lack of gender sensitivity in certain of their recommendations, and that one could go one step deeper down and try to sort of professionalize or proficient the analysis in terms of looking at the causes of the findings and the consequences for women. But all in all, the SPT is definitely up there on the top. The Committee Against Torture's attention to women in detention has increased, I would say, steadily over the past years, both quantitatively and qualitatively, especially since 2009, 2010. So this obviously coincides with the Bangkok rules, which is a positive feature. Now we can see that over the last 6 years, about 1/3 of the reports coming out of CAT have some mention of women in detention, occasionally also gender sensitive, but quite weak on that point. CEDAW is the third committee, and here we can say that they really lag significantly behind. They do this mostly in quantitative terms. Now, CEDAW is a very active body, the most active of the four. They have released 156 reports in 6 years, so that's quite a lot. And only in 17 reports, so about 10%, they actually pay attention to women in detention. I should say at the same time that once they do pay attention, they do it in a very comprehensive way and in a very gender-sensitive way. So while they're lacking behind in quantity, they're certainly to some extent catching up in quality. And they do that, I should also say, both at policy level and also at the practical level. And finally, the runner-up, what do they call it? The Human Rights Committee. Very, very few and very, very brief mentions of women in detention, mostly framed in very general terms and with almost no gender sensitivity. So I'm happy that no one's here from the Human Rights Committee today. But in conclusion, just to say, to wrap all of this up, that there is still a long way to go, I would say, in terms of addressing women's needs and vulnerabilities. I think a promising trend has been that we've seen that these Bangkok rules have had an impact, even though most of the bodies don't refer to them directly or certainly not refer to them individually, then at least they are on the radar of the UN bodies. And now Jo Baker, since she's the lead author, I'm sure that she would tell me, if I had asked her, that I should also give a voice of the women in detention, because I'm just talking about the UN practice. And actually this book is mostly about the voices of the women in detention. So I picked just one voice. It's not very positive, but I think it portrays the life of women in prison, and therefore I think it's important for all of us to get that feel. This is a woman in Zambia who is imprisoned in the central prison in Lusaka, and she says, "One day I will leave prison, but I have no chance. I am done. A woman who has been in prison is done." So those were the words from my side. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Theresa. This was a bit sobering, but I think it explains why we have set up this side event in the first place, and why we think it's very suitable to have it on the day of discussion on women's rights. Also, we think all the issues that are raised here and the lack of awareness about these topics and about the Bangkok rules also make a point that maybe next year's day of discussion should also include the issue of women in detention and women in the criminal justice system, to maybe boost the coverage of the UN bodies and also certainly the Human Rights Council on issues related to women offenders, women prisoners, suspects, defendants, and all the issues that we are hearing about today. There is another very important process going on at the UN, which is, of course, the formulation of the new development goals, the post-2015 agenda. And just to paint a little picture, as the research shows, of course, most prisoners are marginalized and poor people, but this is an even more pronounced feature of women prisoners, usually with a lower level of education. And interestingly, very high rates of non-violent economic offenses that they're charged with or imprisoned for. So one cannot help but wonder, is there a link between what some bodies call the feminization of poverty and the increasing rate of incarceration of women? And can there be a goal in the post-2015 agenda that takes into account discrimination of women in this area, and access of women to justice, which includes women that are suspects, defendants, or prisoners. I would like to welcome very much Nurul Rashid, who has joined us from UN Women. Nurul, you have the floor.
A big thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting UN Women to participate. My colleagues have spoken in great detail about the specific conditions of women in detention, and also the legal, national and international obligations of member states to protect women's rights in prison. And those are very, very important, relevant discussion in relation to protection of women in prison. What I want to do is to shift gears a little bit and bring the discussion into this broader, wider context of the post-2015 agenda. As most of you are aware, there has been a flurry of activities before the post-2015 discussions that will take place globally and particularly at UNHQ on the progress of achieving the MDGs. There are very important policy-level developments on women justice and the post-2015 agenda. It's important to talk about that, but it's also important to try and articulate gender equality, women's empowerment at another level. How do we translate this into reality and also into the work of the United Nations in supporting member states on rule of law, particularly on justice and corrections, in order to achieve these sort of broader MDG goals. And the goal that we will focus on today is really on gender equality and women's empowerment, MDG number 3. It is very clear that the centerpiece of the post-2015 agenda is to end gender injustices. And that includes discrimination throughout the justice system that has led to women being incarcerated, as discussed by my colleague, but also in many instances the violence that women faced at the domestic level, in developing countries, in developed countries, in post-conflict countries, in many, many contexts. And these create barriers to to women and girls' opportunities. And these opportunities would include accessing decent work, access to land and inheritance, access to health and education. So achieving these goals, these MDG goals, is also essential, a precondition for women to access justice itself. So without education, for example, awareness of rights and decision-making power, women are very often, in many contexts, not able to claim their rights. They're not able to obtain legal aid or go to court and defend themselves. Part of the flurry of activities that we're talking about is the high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda. And in our view, peace and gender should not be confined to very specific goals. We have been working with the Open Working Group on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, to make sure that gender perspectives are integrated into all the relevant focus areas. And this would include achieving peaceful and inclusive societies, particularly on rule of law, effective and capable institutions. So these are very broad sort of areas, but it's also important to try and incorporate very consistently the very specific gender perspectives that we want to see. The target areas, for example, strengthening mechanisms for formal and non-formal dispute resolution at all levels should include references to gender, and it should meet specific needs of women from our experience in providing rule of law support to member states. So there are very specific areas that we can work on at the policy level to make sure that, for example, you have gender-sensitive corrections services, you have gender-sensitive delivery of services by judges, by prosecutors, and by police. And these are all very important to contribute to what my colleagues have been talking about, which is to try and keep women out of prison and also to reduce the violence and the discrimination that exists once women are entered the criminal justice system. There are a number of reports that I want to highlight, and it's important to try and take a look at some of these reports and the recommendations. These are not just, I think, reports that we produce on an annual basis. In particular, the UN Women's 2011 Progress on the World's Women report in Pursuit of Justice. You can find this on our website. And it talks about the progress, very important, it talks about the progress that countries have made in the context of the MDGs, highlighting where laws and justice systems work well. They do provide an essential mechanism for women to realize their human rights. They also highlight the challenges and the gaps in many of these places where further reform is needed. And they include a series of recommendations on making justice systems work for women to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment goals. Now, I'm going to break that down a little bit into some very specific examples. What exactly do we mean by using the justice system to achieve gender equality and to empower women? A good reference point would be, for example, the Secretary General's 7-point action plan. And you can find this in his 2010 report on gender responsive peace building. Very important sort of guidelines for the UN, who are UN entities who are working in post-conflict situations, working on police, justice, and corrections. The very specific obligations for the United Nations to make sure that the approach to rule of law before, during, and after conflict systematically promote women's and girls' rights to security and justice. I work with UN Women, but I am co-located with this arrangement called the Global Focal Point. And the Global Focal Point is managed by UNDP and DPKO. They bring together the rest of the United Nations entities, such as UNODC, OHCHR, UNICEF, other humanitarian agencies as well as UN Women, to work together on rule of law support to member states in conflict, in post-conflict and crisis contexts. We work on 3 areas: police, justice, and corrections. The approach is to work with the entire penal chain system, and we do this because we understand that if one part of the justice system doesn't work, other parts may not work either. You cannot focus solely on corrections and building prisons and improving conditions if you do not work on reasons as to why, for example, women go to prison in the first place. So it's important to focus on the problems in the justice system. It could be the formal justice system, and it could be the informal justice system that could lead to the unjustified incarceration of women in prison. We work with development partners such as UNDP, UNFPA, and also we hope to work with humanitarians such as UNHCR. Why do we want to put together or bring together all these resources and expertise together? The reason is because this is an ideal opportunity for the development partners and the humanitarian partners to pursue this wider gender equality and women empowerment goals. Our role in the Global Focal Point arrangement is to precisely look for these opportunities in police, justice, and correction support to try and promote gender equality. And in Somalia, for example, we have a large rule of law program. UN Women is part of this program, and we systematically try to ensure that women participate in the justice system, they are represented in the justice system, that they will eventually become judges, that they will eventually take up decision-making level in the police, and also that they will eventually be more involved in prisons at all levels, including decision-making levels. And these are very important to contribute in the long term to achieving empowerment and gender equality. So those are the very conscious sort of efforts that UN Women try to integrate into a very big, important rule of law programs in places such as Somalia and Mali and South Sudan before the crisis, in Central African Republic. There are real opportunities for us right now to try and achieve these goals through reform of the criminal justice system. The Global Focal Point also conduct joint missions. We do joint mission. We visit prisons. We visit prosecutor's office and police and so on and so forth. When I visited with the Global Focal Point a women prison in South Sudan, the message is very clear. We saw women lying about in a female detention center. There weren't that many of them. There were less than 100. And many of these women were sitting around doing absolutely nothing. And the reason is because of lack of resources, lack of creativity in trying to engage the women and trying to get them to do some work or even engage in activities that could lead eventually to empowering these women. And this could be small educational type of activities. So none of this was in existence. Some of the women suggested that perhaps we could have a shelter in the courtyard where we could sit together instead of being out there in the sun. And we can do some work, and we can do knitting, we can do some small arts and crafts activities just to start off and see where we can go from there. Maybe we can sell these products. Maybe we can do something instead of just sitting around in the hot sun. And I think a lot of the blame, not the blame, but also a lot of the fault is not just with the prison system, but also with the United Nations in not coming up with sufficiently focused programs, particularly for female detainees, in the belief that women in prison do not constitute a large part of the population. And although they are vulnerable, the resources, donors are very slow in funding programs for reform of female prisons. And I think that is the fact that we have seen in many parts of post-conflict situation that we've been working on. Just shifting from corrections, in Mali, we met 2 victims of sexual violence, and they tell us the same thing. We don't want to be labeled as victims anymore. We want to work. We want the UN to help us find employment. We want to look after our children. We are now alone and stigmatized because of what had happened to us. The message that we are trying to send in the post-2015 agenda is that you need to link economic empowerment, you need to link livelihood support to support for women, or to support for reform of the criminal justice system, be it in the police or judicial support or in imprisonment. There are a number of opportunities that we can explore as the UN in supporting supporting member states to infuse or to integrate economic empowerment activities as well as livelihood support to some of these women. Small things matter, small steps do matter to these women in a society or in countries where there really isn't much, and there really isn't much that the states can do to support many of these women. I just want to finish off by talking about, relating to an experience that I had in Indonesia. In Indonesia, I was working on 7 prisons to reform these prisons, and visited one female prison that was actually not within the agenda of our support. And this prison really did not, for a long time, receive any international support. They received some training here and there, but really not the sort of extensive support that we were providing the other prisons through our work. And this was one of the best female prisons that I had visited. And the reason was because the female warden, and she had a largely female staff, was running the prison as though she was running her home. She understood that many of the prisoners who had come to her prison came from very socially and economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Some of them were in there for prostitution, as my colleague had pointed out. Some of them were in there because they had ran away and their parents had complained about them. But many of them simply did not have anything else to do if they left prison, had pretty much nowhere to go. And what she did was to try and engage with civil society organization, bring them in on her own at no additional cost, to provide them with some educational support. She had classes, very basic literacy classes. She also managed to get a company to come in and provide them with some work to do. And that was how she tried to manage the prison and run the prison, to make sure that the prisoners are empowered while they are in prison, so that in that small step they can go outside and do something more instead of being labeled as prisoners or as victims. I compared this to my own experience in Iraq some years back, and I met a girl who was in prison because she was threatened by her family member. She was, she was threatened with honor killing by her family members, and she was there essentially on preventive protection to protect herself. She was there for 8 months, and I suspect she will be there for quite some time, but absolutely nothing was done to empower her, to provide support to her. This woman was a victim when she entered prison. She was likely to be a victim when she left prison. So there are differences that we can make, and even member states and authorities can make small steps that they can take. And to me, this is the definition of gender equality and women's empowerment. Those very small steps that you can take in that very small world in order to improve the lives of women. So I hope that that we do not have to look at the MDG goals as something which is so unattainable and so far away. There are many things that we can do. The MDGs goals are there to assist and to guide us at the larger policy, global level. But, when it comes to working, in post-conflict and crisis contexts, I think that there are small steps that we can take that might lead to bigger goals. And again, I want to thank the organizers for this invitation. And I hope we will have a good discussion thereafter on all these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nurul. I like the can-do approach, and I can only emphasize that it is in fact not such an unachievable goal to improve corrections and improve penal systems so that they're gender equal. It's not always a very expensive thing to do. Much of it is really about awareness and attitude. And also just to stress that, of course, the question of how do you prepare women in prison for rehabilitation and reintegration once they're released is a key issue that we didn't have time to cover today, but it was touched upon that very often rehabilitative programs are either not available for women, or they're fewer or lower quality, or they're very gendered in providing knitting and sewing and cooking, but not anything that women could then following release lead self-sufficient lives and be less dependent from male family members. I realize we have bombarded you with all sorts of information. You didn't have a single chance yet to squeeze in even a sentence or a question, so it is high time that I invite you to do so. Rachel, please.
Rachel Brett, Quaker UN Office. Thank you very much indeed for some very interesting presentations. And I have a number of comments on different ones. On the question of the treaty bodies and their responses and lack of responses, I think it's worth, first of all, saying that it would be worth looking at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, because although they're coming from the perspective of the child, they are becoming steadily more active on issues to do with parental imprisonment, as well as the issues directly around the children. Secondly, on that, I always feel very strongly that it's not fair or relevant to just criticise the treaty bodies. The criticism needs to also go to the NGOs and the national human rights institutions, because if they don't provide the information to the treaty bodies, it is unreasonable to expect the treaty bodies to actually come forward themselves, since the government is unlikely to provide them with the relevant information. So I think the action point there is very much that information needs to go in appropriate ways that will then hopefully improve the responses. Secondly, unless I've missed it, I don't think anyone has mentioned two particular problems. One is about birth registration for babies born in prison. And this can be a real problem, usually for bureaucratic reasons. And we've got a current situation that's just been brought to my attention in the Ukraine, where we have children who are actually at risk of statelessness because of the inability to register their births. So I think this is an area that SPT and others could really just be aware of and think about when they're doing any work in visiting prisons. Check what those procedures are and whether they are actually meaning that children are not going to get registered at birth. Another group that really, in talking with prison professionals, is increasingly of concern is the foreign national women prisoners. That, again, this is a large group. Again, very often it's linked to drugs issues. It's also very often linked to migrant worker issues, particularly female domestic migrant workers. And for those who are concerned, this is something that they wrestle with, because we talk about reintegration, we talk about family contact, we talk about all these things. If you're a foreign national and your family is in another country and you're going to be deported at the end of your sentence, these things mostly are irrelevant in the worst sense. And I think that this is an area that it would be well worth some really much more serious consideration about the practicalities as well as the other rules. Finally, I'd like to flag a piece of good news, which was that last autumn, the Supreme Court of British Columbia in Canada overturned the minister's decision to close the mother and baby unit at the only mother and baby unit in the provincial women's prisons in British Columbia. It's the Inglis case. It was an extremely good judgment, well worth reading, because it actually looked at it and found a violation of the charter rights of both the mothers and the babies. And I have indications, though not confirmation, as of today, that the mother and baby unit, not the same one, but in fact a new one, is in fact being reopened either today or very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm afraid there are many issues that we didn't have time to cover today, which prompts me to make the point again that this was really just a tentative mini-day of discussion, and we should probably have a more comprehensive discussion next year on the same day. Let me just see whether there are any other comments, questions before I invite the panelists to respond, or maybe add anything that hasn't come up yet. Please.
Thank you very much, Marie-Louise Victim from the Danish mission. Thank you very much to the panel for interesting presentations, and well, for participants to being here. I feel I'm the only lay person in the room on a very sort of specific subject, which I've learned a lot about. I have to confess that I don't know the Bangkok rule by heart, but so my question to you is, I was wondering, you Teresa, you're sort of the voice from one of these women saying that she was done after prison. There was no life for her, and this whole issues that many of you have returned to on the stigmatization of women coming out of prison, so and after they are in prison. How does the Bangkok rule say anything on this issue? Because it seems like that's something that has to be dealt with also outside the prison. I take the point by Mr. Rashid on the necessity to empower women while they're in prison, and that can sort of be one answer. But I'm curious to sort of get your take on what are the supplementary measures that we would have to look on at, perhaps outside the Bangkok rules, if it's not already included, to address this issue, because I think that's we have the same. We're discussing in another context on the women coming out of detention centers in Syria, for instance, which is of course that you have this. They're faced with the fact that they will be victimized and sort of excluded from society, because people will be sure that all sorts of things have happened to them in the prisons, whether that's and how do you make sure to, how do you then go about giving redress for that, and because most women will then prefer not to say what happened to them, etc., etc. So this whole area of stigmatization around women in prisons, I find really difficult challenge. So it'd be interesting to any of you whether you have a take on what to do about it.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Sorry, pizza.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to our panelists. We food for thought for all of us. I think we leave this room this afternoon at least with more knowledge of what the challenges are and what needs to be done by way of interventions. I was, like Rachel, going to raise the issue of women migrant workers because it was an issue that I didn't quite pick up from the panelists, but it has been raised. I think it is very, very important that we address that issue and look into it, because it is also on the increase globally. So it is a matter where attention should be drawn, particularly in regard to women prisoners who are migrants as well. But indeed, we need to look into, while women and men are in correctional facilities or in prisons, we need to look at how we empower them for their life after. Because it becomes important that when they are reintegrated into society, that they really take part in active economic activities that do not, lead again to the temptations and going back to prison. So that's one. The number two would be the conditions or circumstances that lead in the first place to incarceration and detention. And I'm very sure that in Africa, in our part of the world, the whole issue of poverty and underdevelopment, it's a massive issue for us. So the root causes need to be looked into. Last year or the year before, our president did come up with a blanket a decision to reduce the prison population, and decided that several people be given parole and should go home and engage in active economic activities. The kind of crimes that were committed by the same people within a day or two of release was shocking. It was just shocking to the country, and it is because of the issue raised here by UN Women that maybe while they are there, we need to empower them appropriately so that when they get out of there, they look forward to opportunities in society and in the economy, and also have a life of dignity. Because otherwise, then when they are there, they are idling, they don't have work opportunities, the very next temptation is to commit crime and go back again. Finally, just the ambassador is not here. We have been engaging with the resolution, the Danish resolution on torture. I was going to make an appeal on the ambassador. I know my country, for the last 10 years or 15 years, we've been doing our best to try and make the resolution talk to the real challenges of the contemporary world. But the resolution, it's really not taking that quantum leap to deal with torture. I think the UN system has now started to realize that when all of us thought that torture was a thing of the past, but really the war on terror and the associated practices have just resuscitated torture. And we need to look into those. There are detention centers where not only women, but males as well, when they go into those places, we just dread as to what will happen to them, and the secret detention centers that exist everywhere. So the resolution by Denmark, for us, it has a huge substantive gap, which it is not filling. And the ambassador is not here, but we will talk to him as well, needs to reflect on those issues. We support universal ratification by 2024. And all others, the OPCAT and everything, we support that. Even ourselves are working in that direction. So, but the substance of what the resolution should cover, in order to make protection a reality for people, would need to be taken on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to hear from South Africa. And on the note of resolution, I'm aware of the resolution on violence against women as well, which I think could mention the link between violence against women and women in detention, and also contribute that way to raising awareness about these issues and the Bangkok goals. I think I'll just start here and give the panel a chance to respond.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your question, or rather your comment about what treaty bodies that we reviewed. It's a very good point that CRC could be included, and actually we have sneaked in a few references to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, specifically because they actually also have this issue on their radar. I should say also at the same time that when we were sort of devising this study, we could see that there were other possible conventions, like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There too we could include, because some women in prisons have disabilities, but we chose here to not look at women with multiple sort of vulnerabilities, but take women as the core group. So that's why you're going to just find a few references here from the CRC. On the other issue of who's responsible, then it's true, of course, it's a shared responsibility to promote human rights and to promote the Bangkok rules. I still think that, having been given the specific mandate in the convention to monitor states' compliance with the convention, it's still the treaty bodies that are primarily responsible for protecting and promoting the UN norms. Of course, having said that, I completely agree that they cannot do that fully without the cooperation of civil society and national human rights institutions. So this is our role, and I hope that we fill it out sufficiently. We try at least to do our best. I think, Marie-Louise, on the question of stigmatization, I think I'm going to turn that over to Andrea, because I think you're probably more aware of this particular side of the rules. Yes, I think that's it for now. I mean, one thing perhaps, Marie-Louise, is the question on preparing women for the life after prison. That's, as mentioned before, that they're not these stereotypes, that you don't only have specific types of work which you can't earn a living afterwards. I mean, that's one area of it, but the more sort of abstract question of stigmatization, I can't answer that, but maybe you can.
Yeah, because I've spoken a lot, I'll give the floor to the panelists, and then I'll try to answer any remaining questions.
Actually, nothing to add. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrea. Just maybe I didn't mention, but the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women report mentions the issue of foreign national women prisoners. So I didn't mention it in the presentation, but it's in her report. Maybe not analyzed into the depth that you would have wished, but it's there, so it's recognized and on the agenda. And the other on this issue, I think it would be important, to reiterate the point that also the Special Rapporteur has made, that is really used as special rapporteurs also as an advocacy channel, as an advocacy means for the application of the Bangkok rules, because I myself personally I think there is not a great deal of knowledge about the Bangkok rules by the special rapporteurs, by the mandate holders. And for example, when you look at an issue like foreign national women prisoners, you can look at a whole range of other special rapporteurs, not just the violence against women. You can look at the special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, who actually visits most probably detention places of migrants and places where these migrants are held in administrative detention, and could have a particular attention to this issue and could query the officials on whether they know about the Bangkok rules or how they apply and how they integrate it into their national legislation and into the national practices. Likewise, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, she visits places of detention, because as we said, there are sometimes traffic victims that actually are incarcerated for prostitution, or rather, even if they shouldn't be, but sometimes they are. So, I think you have a wide range of Special Rapporteurs, many of whom visit detention centers, and I think could be made much more aware or sensitized about the Bangkok rules, and maybe a study like that one done on the treaty bodies could also be helpful on the special procedures mechanism side. Thank you.
I'll just very briefly respond to your questions about women who may have been subjected to SGBV, or men and women subjected to SGBV while in detention, whether it be in prison or ad hoc sort of detention facilities that you see coming up in conflict countries or post-conflict situations. UN Women does work with other UN agencies, and in fact, it is a central part of our peace and security mandate to provide survivor services to rape victims, be it men or women. This would mean that women or victims who have been raped are either in detention facilities or in refugee camps or anywhere else in a post-conflict context. So a large part of our work is devoted to providing support to survivors. And this could include psychosocial support, counseling, medical care, and also to provide them with legal services should they require it. It hasn't been very expansive in the sense that, we are not able to reach a lot of survivors and victims, particularly in situations like Syria. We know that, women and men have been detained, that they have been subjected to sexual abuse. The question is of accessing these detainees and prisoners. It has been very difficult. So what we can do is to provide this type of support services, working with humanitarians when they leave, when they are released and they are in refugee camps, or when they leave the country outside of Syria. So then we are able to access and provide those services to them. I think, though, that doesn't respond sort of the overall question of how do we basically prevent, and respond to sexual violence in prison and the stigmatization that comes after. And I think it is very, very important, and, colleagues have been working, in various committees to do precisely that, to try and prevent sexual violence, particularly in places where they are more vulnerable, in detention facilities and prisons. I think we have not been providing enough attention or providing enough resources to try and do prevention work. I think we need to be slightly more creative about how we do prevention work in many of these places. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to really focus on preventing sexual violence in prisons instead of, after the fact, responding to and providing services to survivors of sexual violence.
Joe, did you want to add something?
I wouldn't mind, actually.
Go ahead.
I thought I'd give a quick plug to our report. Having been working on it for a year or so, I also have a few nuances I thought I might bring out. I think they're useful to humanize the subject, or I think that the panel has done very, very well, and thank you very much. I also think it shows the interconnectedness of a lot of these rights, the importance of the Bangkok rules, and the importance of gender sensitivity among the treaty bodies in understanding some of the violations that they're looking at. So just a few examples. In Jordan, where a vast amount of women are in administrative detention, a number of them have undergone honor crimes. This means that you have women who are imprisoned very shortly after undergoing horrific, brutal incidents. They might have had their children, their babies, newborn babies, delivered. They might be suffering from multiple stab wounds. They might have lost limbs, and they're in prison. And it goes without saying that there really aren't the services that they need to recover. And I think that's a really important point. In talking about contact with the outside world, it's really nice to try and pull in some of these gender threads that we've been talking about, in the sense that if a woman doesn't receive many visits because, for example, the prison is far away, if there are no decent income generating programs within the prison, two very important things that are often raised, then she's more likely to be exploited, and she's more likely to fall victim to survival sex. And I just think it's very interesting to pull together all these strands. So, for example, one Philippine NGO I spoke to said, we have a phrase in the Philippines, we call it holding on to a knife for your life. And this is how he described the situation of some women in prisons there, even though in some cases the Philippines also did very, very well. And we have a number of good practices from a couple of Philippine detention centers and also from Albania. And I think it was nice, you were speaking about in Indonesia, you found a very positive environment for women And we also found one prison in particular in Albania, which, despite numbers of structural challenges and support challenges, the director was, she had a social welfare background and a real sense of what the women in her care needed, and it was a really positive experience. So if you get the chance to read this and just to get some of the nuances that we haven't been able to talk about today, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and congratulations on the report, which I recommend you to read. Maybe you can show it again, and you can pick up copies
There's a whole pile
in the
down
back.
there, and be quick because there's only 100 copies. So everybody gets to the first. So thank you.
And since we're on an advert session, let me also show you PRI's guidance document on the Bangkok rules. I think since we're running out of time, I will be very mean and say, if you have further questions on the content of the Bangkok rules, read the guidance document. And also, I would like to point you to an internet-based training course that PRI is providing free of charge. So you can become specialists in a very easy, accessible, and free of charge way on what the Bangkok rules provide, including case examples, country examples. It's very interactive with input that you can give, and we hope that all these tools will help rectify some of the deficiencies that we've heard out of, and bring together a really powerful combination of UN bodies, NGOs, states, governments, prison authorities to finally address some of the gaps that we have seen in the treatment of women, suspects, defendants, and prisoners. And with that, I would like to thank you again very, very much for sticking with us, for your attention, and a big, big thanks and applause to our panel. We're extremely grateful, and I think Dignity and PRI have cooperated very, very well on this, and we'll keep pushing on the Bangkok rules. It's not the last time you heard about this, I'm afraid to say. Thank you very, very much, and have a good rest of the session of the day of discussion today. Thank you.